Taking this into account, I have thought it would be a good idea to talk about the partition, an event which is a tragic historical landmark in India. It caused thousands of deaths and provoked a new scenario in the subcontinent. Millions of people would be displaced, millions would be wounded, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions more, would die, and a new scenario arose in India. I believe that humankind has to learn from the past in order to amend errors, or at least to try to find answers and examples in past historical events in order to walk towards a better world. Unfortunately, the time is ripe to rethink past traumatic episodes like the partition of the Indian subcontinent. More than 70 years have passed, and the effects caused by this local episode seem to have repercussion at this moment in the history of both the Western and Eastern worlds. The historical background of current times, the move towards new ways of radical nationalisms, the religious confrontations and fundamentalisms that have led to international terrorism, makes it necessary to look back on the past in an attempt to hopefully search for restoration of the present. There is an objective political history and events that led to what was known as the Indian Summer. But there are also hidden histories behind the great names of the partition, names like Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Ali Jinnah, Winston Churchill, Dickie Mountbatten, and his wife Edwina. The truth that lies behind the real history, nobody can know. But what is true is that the partition of India is a story of violence and loss. While India and Pakistan gained independence, the British Empire lost its greatest colony. Gandhi lost his dream of achieving a united nation that would gather Muslims and Hindus, and the first leader of democratic India, Jawaharlal Nehru, felt that all his dreams of life and freedom had turned into chaos and distraction. Heroism and incompetence caused one of the major holocausts in the 20th century. The days of British splendor were gone, the great names were put to the margins, and the margins came to the fore. In the 1970s, the personal stories of the common people began to be considered. The new millennium has produced some innovative studies in the partition history. It is in this new social framework that women appear on the scenery of partition as a subaltern group and with specific ways of having experienced the episode. Parallel to the political negotiations that took place over the years and that ended up in the tragic outcome, there was a movement among women pushed by Kamala Nehru, who had married the Indian leader, Nehru. She had married Nehru when she was 17, and though being barely educated, she devoted herself to the cause of women, pushing forward their fight for rights, education, and struggle for their independence in the patriarchal society of the subcontinent. This was later undertaken by Edwina Mountbatten, who called for the emancipation of women despite the backwardness of the country, the illiteracy rate, and the low standards of living. So women acquired an active role in the political sphere when the country was getting ready for independence. But these efforts were unsuccessful, and even more, women were the group that was most violently affected by the horror of partition, which somehow was connected with the social reality of women in the subcontinent. According to official records, there was widespread sexual savagery. About 75,000 women are thought to have been abducted and raped by men of religions different from their own. Therefore, despite the efforts made by great public women previous to the partition, the stories of women that were affected by the historical episode are also stories of loss, because reality shattered their dreams to achieve any possible expectation in the aftermath of partition. These stories are those of women who suffered silently and who still today have not conquered spaces of freedom as human beings. They live on the other side of silence. However, the partition of India is much more than just a historical fact. It is a compelling literary theme that still today continues to inspire creative outpourings by writers. History and narration and nation intermingle. Perhaps this is both an attempt to overcome the tremendous trauma created by the event and to bear witness to the forces of communalism, class divide, and patriarchy behind the violent division, which continues to play out across the Indian subcontinent today and even throughout the world in different subtle ways. Literature serves the purpose to reflect such terrible episodes in the history of humankind. By rereading the past horrors of our history, we can maybe shed light to hidden clues of understanding among us in our contemporary times. In this slide, you have interesting readings about the consequences of the partition, as for example, the Punjab bloodied, partitioned and cleansed and revealing the 1947 tragedy through secret British reports and first-person accounts, changing homelands, Hindu politics and the partition of India, and borders and conflict in South Asia, the Radcliffe Boundary Commission and the partition of Punjab. So if you're interested here, you will find the event tackled from many different perspectives. Thus, the theme of partition has inspired many Indian writers and has been tackled from many different perspectives, both in the corpus of Indian literature and Indian English narrative. If you have a look at the slide, you have several representative examples there. Novels like Train to Pakistan, Tamaz, Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, short stories like Tobat Song by Sadat Hasamanto, and poems even like Faiz and Faiz, who lamented the Holocaust in what was translated as Freedom's Dawn in 1974. My talk would deal with Indian English narrative, in particular female Indian English narrative, which has to be considered from a threefold perspective: history, nation, and narration. Indian writers have always represented the idea of India, and so they have linked the image of India to specific historical moments. The case of the partition that took place in 1947 is one of the most shocking episodes in the history of the subcontinent. So we find many literary examples that tackle the event, like Train to Pakistan by Kushwant Singh, published in 1956, Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, published in 1981, The Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh and published in 1988. These are but a few of the examples of narratives where history and story intermingle and the individual lives of the characters are affected and reflect the impact of the division of the nation. As I said, Indian women writers have also tackled this theme. The way they represent the shock of partition is very much related with the situation of women in India. My aim is to diachronically analyze some examples of female Indian narrative, and then you've got the three novels that I'm going to talk about: Sunlight on a Broken Column, published in 1961 by Atia Hossain, Clear Light of Day, published in 1980 by Anita Desai, and An Unrestored Women, published in 2016 by Shobha Rao. I will specifically focus on how women characters build up their memories of the historical event as a narrative of loss, through which eventually we can identify the trace of gender violence as linked to the concept of nationalism in an attempt to restore the past and the present. Following this train of thought, I will explain, as I said, from a diachronic perspective, the novels of these aforementioned three Indian female authors, and I will focus specifically on the female characters in all three novels. My aim is to emphasize this threefold perspective I mentioned and prove how female writing in English in its evolution becomes a tool to denounce once more the reality of women in India. Previous to the analysis, several questions arise that somehow would lead our approach and our analysis of the main female protagonists. Questions like, what is the role of women in the history of this event? How does history shape their stories? Where lies the link between history and memory? And in fact, what are their stories? The marginal place that women have historically, culturally, and socially occupied in the Indian society provides the background to the way women have given answers in their narratives to the questions previously posed. According to John Kelly, women's history has a dual goal: to restore women to history and to restore our history to women. So we will prove how the novels under analysis achieve the aim of making women a focus of inquiry, a subject of the story, and an agent of the narrative. Traditionally, female Indian English writing has been the space where women have found their voice, claiming for a redefinition of their identity. But above all, this fiction represents the evolution of the social situation of women, which has always been linked to their historical circumstances. Official records of the partition appear to exclude women, but it is not due to the fact that they were absent from the event. On the contrary, no account of the horrors of partition would be faithful to reality if it does not touch the violence that women experience at that historical moment. Women were the silent subjects of the event, and this is where partition female fiction plays a role. The official historical records of the true stories of women seem to be unreliable data, and the written history of women simply non-existent. Grandmothers told their stories to their daughters, and they transmitted them to their granddaughters. Contemporary female Indian English writing aims to restore the wreckaged history of women, and those stories that were part of the oral tradition seem to be given voice through female narratives of partition. Female fiction pays homage to those hidden figures of history, and the memories from partition aim to rehabilitate their stories. These stories, as we shall see, are intrinsically narratives of loss of homes, loss of friendships, loss of families, of love, and most importantly, a profound loss of a sense of belonging, and in their loss, a shared destiny. Female narratives of partition aim to emphasize the chasm between history and memory, but with an aim for rehabilitation and restoration. Paradoxically, the partition meant a world falling apart, but for historians it signified the beginning of a new constitutional order, a new political arrangements, and therefore the survivors should start anew. That Holocaust would bring about a reconstitution of community and history. Historical memory blends with private individual memories that ultimately shape the fictional stories of female experiences, depicting a period in the history of the nation that in turn represents the real situation of women in the Indian subcontinent. In my analysis of the novels, I identify a threefold process regarding how the authors tackle the female experience of partition, and those are memories of rescue, memories of recovery, and memories of rehabilitation. This is the same process undergone by many abducted and raped women during the partition. For this purpose, I will focus on the main female characters in the novels and how their identities and memories are construed in relation to the historical moment of partition. The first novel, entitled Sunlight on a Broken Column, is considered an autobiographical novel. The author, Hossein, had to face the fragmentation of her family due to partition, and this is reflected in the novel. She tells the story of an upper-class Muslim family in transition, which goes parallel to the events that led to the important changes in the nation and that eventually ended up in the historical event. The story of this family represents the situation that many Hindu and Muslim families had to suffer with partition. The story presents a first-person narration by Laila, the main female character, and the author weaves her individual story parallel to the political crisis that the nation was facing. However, the human story overtakes the political events since the characters take part in the political affairs of the country. 20 years are covered both of the family story and the Indian history from 1932 to 1952. And all throughout, we observe the evolution of orphan Layla, who in turn epitomizes the evolution of women in the country. There is a temporal flow that brings the reader back and forth in time. The beginning of the story shows Layla having to face her grandfather's illness and death. We are told of the resultant changes that the domestic environment undergoes at the same time, since the lifestyle of the Zenana seems to start disappearing too. Memories here are of rescue, and the reader is told about ancestral traditions, family relations and tensions, peculiar relatives that come and go, weddings and funerals taking place. Layla is the subject of the story and will gradually evolve into an agent of the narrative. In the second part, we find Layla facing a new life, since she moves to a different house and starts studying at university. In this part, we find a Layla who seems to be torn between two worlds, the British and the Indian. She realizes that the world background she grew up in is in decline, but not much can be done except trying to adjust to changes. She tries to redefine her identity, questioning basic principles on which her class had built up the social hierarchy, influenced by changes that are taking place and by the ideas of freedom and equality brought about by the Western world. Layla then, as I said, is torn between memories of rescue and memories of recovery. She's caught up in the confusion of whether to follow what she thinks is right or what society thinks appropriate. She had always been a troubled and thoughtful child, keeping her thoughts to herself. Layla is constrained by social rules, but she believes in notions of love, equality, and independence. The conception of love and marriage is an aspect worth highlighting in this novel. For other female characters like Thara, marriage is a means to escape from the Purda culture and the strict discipline imposed on unmarried girls. Individual happiness is thus relegated. On the other hand, Layla marries a mayor searching for completeness, so she is truly in love with him. This is one of the most important aspects through which we observe the evolution of Layla, since marriage has always been a controversial issue as related to women's freedom in India. She has evolved into a logical and realistic young lady able to critically analyze important matters because education has enabled her to think and revise the old versus the new. Layla's fragmentation goes parallel to the effects that the partition had on families like hers, fractured and divided by their beliefs, and many of them forced to leave their native land looking for opportunities in a newly formed nation. Layla's assertion of her individual identity projects the freedom struggle the nation is undergoing. In this context, Layla represents a generation of young women immersed in confusion, troubled, and fighting to make a place for themselves in a new changing country. This generation of women endured psychological violence since they had to cope with the social rules of the times and their own individual desires as human beings. The novel illustrates the Indian women of the 1930s and 1940s, victims as they were of the patriarchal system even within the domestic space, as we read about a group of 5 girls questioning life with the knowledge they acquire through literature, which has always meant a space of freedom for women. And it reads, "The five of us spent as much time together as possible. When we were not arguing, we were dissecting and questioning life, with the fear and the courage, the doubts and the certainty of inexperienced questioning youth. Our world was bounded by our books, and the voices that spoke to us through them were great men, profound thinkers, philosophers, and poets." Layla's evolution symbolizes the struggle for social freedom and the quest for her selfhood. In this novel, consequently, we find childhood memories of rescue and recovery before the arrival of the colonizer. The past is used by Layla to shape her identity in a changing present that apparently seems fragmented, just like the nation. But at the same time, her memories of rescue allow for memories of recovery, which turn into memories of restoration and hope. Since not only are we told about the wrongs, faults, and cruelties of the society of the times of partition and the effects it had on women, but we are also left with the celebration of the past, the feudal times that somehow allows Layla to survive as the new woman. Finally, if the partition in this novel is shown as the agent of loss in many spheres of life, through the evolution of the female character of Layla, we foresee a positive attitude towards the future, because the fact that she's able to decide her future means triumphing over the social world in which she lives, and thus the novel ends by emphasizing Layla's divided self. I looked more closely at the face that stared back at me from the dusty mirror. She was so different from me, that girl whose yesterdays and todays looked always towards her tomorrow, while my tomorrows were always yesterdays." In the second novel that we're going to deal with, Clear Light of Day, the reader finds him or herself immersed within the flow of memories that Anita Desai outlines with her unmistakably poetic prose. The narrative flows between the past and the present, the 1930s, from 1947 to 1948, and a few days in the 1970s, distributing the structure of the plot in 4 parts. Again, the story here takes place within a domestic environment, this time in Delhi. And again, the climax of the Das family story is set in times of the partition of the nation. Memories here are linked to memories about the country. There are 2 main female characters, Tara and Bim, 2 women, 2 options, and 2 destinies that in the end converge. The novel starts with Tara revisiting the family home. After having left years ago to marry Kabul, a young diplomat, and having moved to the US, Tara returns home and reunites with her sister Bim, regaining her past at the same time. We perceive the house and the characters' feelings through her eyes. It is in the second part of the novel where the author weaves the plot through memories of rescue and recovery of a lost domestic realm. Precisely in this section coalesce the individual stories of these women and the history of the nation. Childhood memories of the past talk and evoke happiness that contrasts with the events that took place in the summer of 1947, which constitutes the same as in the previous novel, the background for the family fragmentation. The gradual disintegration of both the country and the family run parallel. Memories bring us back to the summer when their mother falls ill and dies, which somehow becomes a metaphor that implies the death of the nation too. In this chapter 2, we most clearly identify the relationship established among history, nation, and narration, as the following quotation illustrates. "Isn't it strange how life won't flow like a river, but moves in jumps, as if it were held back by locks that are opened now and then to let it jump forward in a kind of flood? There are these long steel stretches, nothing happens, and then suddenly there is a crash, mighty deeds take place. That summer was certainly one of them, the summer of 47. At this point, it is when Bim refuses to ever marry and devotes herself to taking care of her aunt and brother. This shows the sacrifice of many women of the time who renounce their social destiny, and they are further driven to the margins. However, she attends college and works as a teacher, bringing to the fore an image of an independent woman, but once more trapped in her destiny. Tara, her sister, on the contrary, stands as the image of a woman who manages to escape the social constraints of her native context. But the image that we get is that of a traitor, almost. She gets married but flees from India to the US. This contrast and division between the two sisters actually represents the division of the country. Memories of Rescue and Recovery seem to aim at remembering the times of school days when the family was together, but they failed to find consolation because the past is not comforting either, since memories are distorted. Remembrances of childhood do not really affect their freedom, nor mental or psychological stability, as opposed to another female character, Aunt Mira, who ends up committing suicide as a result of the recollection of memories from the past. The background here is the moment in which the partition takes place, the nation breaks, and Gandhi is murdered. The past seems to be shattered, and destruction comes about. From this point of the narrative on, it aims for rehabilitation. The female characters try to find the path for understanding their present lives. Memories of Rescue and Recovery have provided the clues for healing wounds, and in the last chapter, the past which meant destruction reveals itself as preserver. Tara and Bim finally come to understand the past. They end up achieving freedom as human beings, finally rediscovering their true selves. Their feelings converge, and they restore the past through love, which is the place where they finally find answers that gather them together. This stands as a metaphor used to remind us that the revision of past episodes like the partition is mainly to restore the present and to avoid making the same mistakes. But above all, it is love and acts of love, the means by which we can prevent our destruction and the destruction of history. To turn to the past means to take courage and face the truth in order to live with it. If people succeed in doing so, they will realize that life means love, love for others, not self-love, which needs the applause of others. Finally, these women, through recovering memories from the past, ultimately achieve freedom, the same as the nation. But contrary to the aftermath of Indian independence that gave way to violence and destruction, these women foresee a clear future, since everything had been said at last cleared out of the way. There was nothing left in the way of a barrier or a shadow, only a clear light pouring down from the sun. History, nation, and narration meet. By remembering, women feel part of the history of their nation, and so the narration reads, "That soil contained all time, past and future in it. It was dark with time, rich with time. It was her deepest self lived, and the deepest selves of her sister and brothers and all those who shared that time with her." We finally come to the last novel. The two previous novels analyzed mainly the psychological aspects of women and use the partition as the milieu of their recollections and as an excuse to show the social violence on women. In this particular case, An Unrestored Woman, on the contrary, drives the reader into an overt context of gender violence and aggression against women. The title of the book is very significant, since the positive outlook on the future of women that we may have inferred from the narratives of the previous authors is clearly shattered. The title explicitly reveals the real situation of women during partition, and the trauma of the event is the point of departure of the stories. The clear purpose of the author is to focus on the violence and horrors of the partition on women. In the preface of the book, the author immediately informs the reader about the brutalities inflicted upon women, and history, nation, and narration are here intermingled. We cannot tell truth from fiction, and the narrative becomes almost a report of the violence that women suffered during the Holocaust. We find the real data of the horror, and this is what we find also in the collection of the 12 stories. Rao seizes the event to show the situation of women in current India and Pakistan. As Butalia says, history is a woman's body.